folks, so let's try this again. I think you saw probably on the last video that I did already record this part for you, but it got cut off. My camera shut off. If you can't tell, I'm in this room by myself, and my phone is facing away from me, so I can't really tell if it stops. They should have maybe there's an app or something. If somebody knows, it'll make the light on my camera blink or something when the phone stops. But I just wanted to make sure that we got this information, this last bit of information about depression, and then go on and talk about suicide and just a little bit about bipolar disorder, just to make sure that you're ready for the test. That test will be posted either with this video or certainly not more than a day or two after it. And then I expect to give you up until next Monday to get it back into me. If that's a problem with some of you, I know that date jumped around a bunch, mostly due to my own planning and trying to figure out how long it would take me to get some of this stuff out. But if that date moving around caused you some problems, if you got some stuff that you're doing otherwise that you've put into that space, and now this is maybe going to be tough for you, go ahead and let me know. Send me an email, and we can talk about getting an extension if you need it. But otherwise, again, this will just be due next Monday, and you'll see that posted probably already, if not within the next couple of days. So I think where I left off, where I saw the video cut off, was talking about some of these demographics here. And I think I was just about to get into ethnicity. I think we did talk about age in terms of older folks being the most likely to be depressed, and then kind of theorizing a bit about that having to do with the fact that this is when a lot of life changes, when life is maybe slowing down, when some of the things that you've either built up for or planned towards or didn't plan towards are going to come to fruition. So retirement, grandchildren, children leaving, all of this type of thing is going to begin to show up. And depending on what that looks like, and depending on how that individual reacts to certain things, right, we might expect that some of those reactions may in fact look like depression, and the research, at least demographically, bears that out to suggest that this is a time when folks are most likely to be depressed. Also correlated with divorce rates and these types of things that may also be happening at this age. So we talked about women being more likely to be diagnosed as having depression, and I think we talked a little bit about that postpartum depression. I think I just mentioned that it's not a diagnosis in and of itself. It is kind of a way to specify the type of major depressive disorder that this person, that the woman is having, as being a postpartum, or at least connected to that postpartum piece. And then I was going to start here talking about ethnicity as is labeled here. I always start this because of this infographic, in particular by going on a bit of a rant about the word Caucasian, which is the last one listed there. The term Caucasian is a little bit outdated and unclear and offensive. It's not for the offensive reason that I bring it up, though I do think folks should be aware of it if you choose to use it. I think you probably shouldn't after you hear what I'm going to say, but your choice. The term Caucasian was used in conjunction with two other terms that looks at race by thinking about it as either being one of three ways. Caucasian being one of those. The other two are two words that we certainly wouldn't use today to describe anyone's race, those being Mongoloid and the other one being Negroid. And so Negroids are probably pretty clear to most folks. Those are going to be black-looking people, folks of African descent, at least middle to southern African descent, as are African Americans and Jamaicans and Haitians, this type of thing. And Mongolians, Mongoloids are going to be folks who are Asian looking, East Asian looking. The problem with these terms is they really have no basis in science. They really are completely to do with what a person looks like, and this really old sense of there being these three broad races: black folks, Asian folks, and white folks. And you know, race is a tricky thing to split up anyway, but the problem with this term Caucasian overall, in addition to its offensiveness in some ways, is the fact that it really doesn't include just white people, which is what they want to mean here, and what I mostly assume folks want to mean when they say Caucasian, is just white people or European American, right? We say African American, and we say black people, and we could say European American and white people, but we tend to say Caucasian. I don't know what that's about, but this term doesn't just include white folks, it includes anybody who does not fit into those other two categories that I described. So anyone who is not of South or Middle African descent, that is to say they don't look like a black person, or anyone who isn't of Mongoloid, that is to say East Asian descent, anyone who doesn't look like a Chinese or a Japanese, right, these East Asian countries, anyone who doesn't look like that is considered Caucasian. Everyone who's not Asian looking or black looking by this kind of terminology is Caucasian. Well, who does that include? That includes Latino folks, that includes Indian folks, both West Indians, that is to say Native Americans, and East Indians, folks from India. This includes Middle Easterners. This includes, again, anybody who's not Asian looking or black looking is really considered Caucasian by this terminology. And so if you don't mean maybe Hispanic, maybe Indian, maybe Middle Eastern, maybe European, then Caucasian probably isn't the right term. So I don't know why this has stuck around so much. I will just be honest and say that I think for whatever reason, folks have problems saying white folks. I don't know why. I think, again, European American would have fit there just fine too. So the reason I go on this particular diatribe here is because this presents a bit of a problem for the graph that I want to show you, which is to say that here we have Caucasians as being the lowest rate of depression at 3.1%. Now, I could assume that that means white people, and it probably does. But the problem now comes with the fact that the largest group at 4.3% is listed as others. Well, what the hell? We've got a confusing term, which probably means white people at the lowest percentage. And then for the highest percentage, we've just got other. That is a problem in research, right? You don't want to put the thing that is showing the most effect and going, this is something else that we didn't think about, or this is something else that we didn't bother to clarify exactly what is driving those numbers up so high. And so here, it's really difficult to tell who is in this other group, especially if you're a little confused, at least, with who is in this Caucasian group. What's worse, of course, is that these are the highest and the lowest statistics. And so we also have up here African American and Hispanic, but they are both sitting at 4%, which is situated right there in the middle. And so we're not really sure who the highest group is, and we're not really sure who the lowest group is by this graph. Luckily, you have a smart professor here in front of you, and I can decipher what's going on here. Caucasians does in fact mean white folks. I wish they would just write white folks or European American, but that holds up in terms of what we understand from research, that white people tend to have the lower rates of depression kind of per capita, not by numbers, not strictly by counting. There are just, at least in the United States, a lot more white people. So by per capita, that is to say per 100 or per 100,000 or whatever you're counting by, less white people tend to be depressed by these statistics. And less white people than these other three groups that we have. And then other is probably Native Americans. Native Americans often have really high mental illness rates. This is just a fact of the matter. They often have high addiction rates. They often have high suicide rates. They often have high depression rates. And so even though this isn't clear, again, this isn't a great graph for this particular statistic, but even though this isn't clear, my guess is that, or at least what's pulling that group up, if other folks are in there, let's say Middle Eastern folks are in there or something, what's really pulling that group up, the other group, is the Native American population, which again, we usually do see is having really high mental illness rates, including depression. So again, what we see here, lowest group of depressed folks, Caucasian or white folks. In the middle, we have African American and Hispanics at 4%, and then the highest group is this group that's listed as others. I would venture to guess that is mostly referring to Native American population in the United States, also Alaska Natives, if you split that difference, but those tend to be the highest group of depressed people by other research that I've seen. I'm going to skip here. I know we were going down this infographic, but I'm going to skip this piece on medical costs. Don't worry, I skipped it the first time too. I'm not particularly interested in that. Maybe if you were in a marketing class or some other type of business or accounting class, that would be important, but I want to talk about psychology. So basically, depression is expensive. Lastly here, this isn't a great graph either, but it does give us a little bit of something. I haven't seen anything else like it, so it's kind of the best we have, or at least the best I know of. And this is just a graph similar to that states graph that you probably saw in the last video, where we're looking at the hotspots of depression by state. Here we're looking at it by country. Again, the sort of problem, quote, problem here is that all of that kind of very light pink is, I doubt those are actual numbers. That is to say, less than 20%, right? If you can see, right, like Africa's right here, maybe hard to see, South America's right here. So the whole world map is there if you can't see it on the screen, but it's just this light pink color at less than 20%, which is indicating that less than 20% of those tested, or the population perhaps, is currently suffering from some form of depression. And that just seems unlikely that all of South America and all of Africa and all of Asia, for the most part, would just have these astronomically low levels of depression when compared to, say, the United States or India or France. And so my guess here again is that this is actually a lack of data. They should have coded it that way, not enough information, rather than grouping it in with the lower levels of depression in certain countries, because now we can't really tell those apart. Maybe we do have data from Brazil, for instance, and it actually does have really low rates of depression, but I can't separate that from Peru or Sudan because, where they may not have had data because they didn't make any choice there. So one thing I do just like to point out is just looking at the three countries that seem to have the highest rates of depression. And unlike some of these other things, I don't really have a big theory as to why the United States and France and then India are sticking out much more, or at least having those highest rates of depression compared to even the other countries that were tested. The only thing that I could come up with, and again, this is not at all scientific, this is really just me using an educated guess, is that at least with the case of France and the United States, that we're a little bit more dramatic of a people, right? Our feelings mean something to us, and you've offended me, and oh my gosh, I'm so upset, this is gonna make my day so bad, right? We're a little bit more like that than, say, somebody from England, or say somebody from Germany, who might be a little less kind of emotionally self-involved the way that, at least stereotypically, and again, this is really just conjecture, stereotypically French people are, and then at least by my own experience, Americans tend to be. So, not a lot of information in terms of certainty here, but it is, I think, a little bit neat to look at just to see at least which of the countries seem to be topping the list of the data that we have. If anybody has more information on this type of map or kind of differences in depression rates by country, I'd be very interested in hearing or learning more about it. So maybe you can make a little bit more of this than I did, but anyway, it is still somewhat interesting. So what we're gonna look at now that we didn't get to last time is thinking about some of the cultural differences and identity differences that show up with regard to depression. Now, we talked about some of that in terms of outcome, that is to say in terms of depression diagnosis, right, just a slide ago, and then somewhat in the last video, thinking about age, thinking about sex or gender, and then also thinking about country, race, these types of things. But again, those have more to do with outcome, right? That just has more to do with, well, who is depressed once they're depressed, right? Like who shows up in the door. Those numbers are derived primarily through you come to a clinic, we give you a diagnosis. At the end of the year, we report we had this many men, this many women, this many people of this blah, blah, blah identity, and this many of those were depressed, this many of those were depressed, this many of those were anxious, right? And then those kind of raw numbers get fed into usually the CDC or something like that, or the National Health Service. I'm not sure if we have one of those. I think that's a British thing, but anyway, you know what I mean? It gets put into some kind of federal registry, and then we compute those things. So, but because of that, right, we only really know when people are showing up depressed. We don't necessarily know what differences, at least from that type of study, what type of differences might be inherent to the depression of this group versus this group. And of course, if you want to talk about some things that might be cultural differences, those are certainly going to be some big pieces. And when I say cultural differences here, I mean really to do with culture, right? That the way that somebody expresses their sadness in the United States is by crying and, you know, looking sad and watching sad movies or something, and the way that you express sadness on Mars is you dig really deep holes and you rub sand in your eyes and you don't shower for 4 weeks, right? Whatever. And so just kind of those is what I'm talking about. Obviously that's not a real example, but just those kind of cultural differences of what depression can look like. So again, that's not necessarily just outcome. Both of those people are depressed if they showed up, and I can record this Martian depression. That is to say, I recognize that it was depression because usually people aren't just putting sand in their hair, but if I go, oh, that's also depression, then those numbers are gonna just get counted. But again, if I'm reading those numbers, I don't really get a sense of how Martian depression is different than Earth depression. And so, long story long, that's what I want to talk about, is how some of these cultural pieces may be different in terms of their experience or different in terms of their manifestation, not just their showing up, but how exactly they show up. In this case, just with sex. So men versus women, compared to women. I'm not sure if I said this in the last video. I'm not sure if I said this in the last video and it got cut off, so I'm going to say it again, maybe more briefly, which is that our understanding of psychology is a strange one. It's a bit sexist and it's a bit mixed up, and because of that, we have to think carefully about how we apply some of our understandings of psychology, particularly with regard to culture, but more and more we're finding out also with regard to race in particular, not race, sex in particular. We'll talk about race here in a little bit. This is because when psychology was coming around, certainly as a talk therapy regimen, right, when we kind of moved a little bit past the white walls and the lobotomies and the straitjackets, right, some of that stuff is obviously still done, but when it wasn't the primary way that we were treating everybody, and talk therapy came into existence, right? This is not very invasive. This is something that could be helpful to you, and obviously it's not going to hurt you. It's not going to be something you're putting in your body. It's not some operation or some procedure I'm doing to you. So it's a little bit more available to folks who may be struggling with something or may just think that they're struggling with something than would be if I'd sent you to a psychiatrist back in the day and they said, well, you know, if you keep doing this, we're going to have to drill 2 holes in your head, right? That as a response to some anxiety or something, some panic disorder versus we're just going to sit you down on the couch and let you talk, is really going to open the doors to a lot more folks. So because of that, what ends up happening is that who's gonna be going to these therapists, these psychologists? Well, it turns out it looked something like man comes home from work, his wife is exhausted from taking care of the house or taking care of the children, or maybe she hasn't had to do that and she's just been sitting around all day and she's really bored or excited to see you, or you know, she's thinking about something that you did wrong, and so you show up and she gives you the business, whatever it is. A lot of these husbands were coming home and saying, well, what's wrong with my wife? She's always upset, or she's always angry, or she's always so tired, or whatever it is, right? This, again, there's some sexism here, right? This kind of perspective of not understanding the woman's life at the time, and thinking that her reaction to kind of the daily stresses of, I don't know, home life or whatever this particular woman's life is, not to mention any type of thing that might have been going on that really was traumatizing or distressing, say abuse or loss of life in the family or divorce, etc. But just even in the kind of more casual, you know, every time I go home, my wife seems really upset and I'm not really sure what to do, right? This husband might say, come on, honey, let's go see this psychologist. And so it turned out that a lot of the folks who were being treated by psychologists in the early days, and therefore a lot of the theories that we have and still use today, are based on women's psychology, and more than that, are based on a male perspective of a woman's psychology. That is to say, these clinicians, these doctors at the time were still primarily, you know, vast majority men. And so the fact that they were treating women means that they are casting their kind of male perspective on what this means, what this looks like, how to classify and understand what's going on here. Because of that, a lot of the symptoms, especially for depression, which I am getting to, a lot of the symptoms for depression are particularly feminized in nature. And that doesn't mean that they're feminine in the sense that we tend to use the word feminine. I just mean here that it's more likely to occur with women than it is to occur with men. There's a tendency to occur with women versus a tendency to occur with men, this true definition of masculine and feminine. So, well, what happens is we kind of just get really used to this definition of depression, right? The stuff we talked about last week, sadness, not wanting to do things, sleeping too much, eating too much, right? All of these things. And under the surface, beneath the surface, we're having men basically feel depressed as well. And remember, we talked about that more bottom-up paradigm where really depression is just a response to loss. And so we can kind of track back and not have to use that top-down definition of, well, depression has to be X, Y, and or Z. But if we think about it as, well, depression really is just how we broadly respond to loss, then we can identify the fact that men may be also being depressed in this way if this is how they tend to respond to loss. And so what we find when we look into that, and I know I spoke about this a little bit, which was we thought about kind of putting that together, and what we ended up with was that dysregulated mood disorder, right? Which is just to say this person who is angry all the time, this person who can't control their temper, and that was trying to get at some of those depressive symptoms that men are more likely to experience. Not that women can't experience them, they certainly can, and not, of course, that men can't experience depression in this more typical way. They certainly can. But when we start to look at that, again, these guys were often being cast into anger management before they even had this dysregulated mood, right? We didn't even have a place for this being any sort of depression, not even just a broader depressive disorder. And so often this would look like something else, especially if these guys were drinking or using any type of drugs or any type of other addiction, gambling or sex or something like that. Well, we would just say, well, this person has an addiction problem, or this guy has an anger problem, or this person has, either some chemical or, like I said, psychological addiction. And we would try to treat that, or we would be compelled or send this person to have those surface level things treated, right? And we have these very specific things. This is interesting to me. I'm just thinking of this now. A lot of pretty typically male problems in psychology are sort of outsourced. So if you think about anger management, of course you can go see a psychologist for that, but it is this sort of segmented, right? There's no depression management or anxiety management, right? There is just anger management, right? This idea that this is kind of a specialized treatment versus you don't even say I'm going necessarily to therapy for depression. You say I'm going to therapy, right? And then also substance abuse. So drinking, alcohol, sex, gambling, all of these things. And then again, we also have this sort of segmented, treatment for addictions, either centers or different programs. So I'm just thinking of this now, which is why I'm staring through it, but it is interesting to me that for some of these ways in which men tend to manifest or act out, that there are these kind of specialized, well, you should probably go to that, you should probably go to that. But I think this is coming back into the fold, right? We're beginning to understand a little bit more that, well, men are just going to experience depression in a different way. That makes sense. And so let's start to look for the ways in which men are experiencing, expressing, or manifesting their depression, their dealings with loss. And so here's something that I put together back in graduate school while I was on my doctoral fellowship. And basically we were asked, hey, if you'd like to add a pamphlet to our waiting room, we would love that. And so we would go down and look in the waiting room and see what they had, and then either maybe edit one of those and add some stuff, or we could kind of create our own. I chose to create this because, we'd have all these pamphlets of, how to know if you're having a panic attack, how to know if, you're depressed, how to know if you've got symptoms of PTSD or something. And so I wanted to put together something that says, how to identify if you're a man and you have depression, but you don't see yourself in these other depression pamphlets. You're not sad, you're getting out of bed fine, you've got your same diet, but something doesn't feel right, and maybe this would help somebody kind of think through that. So here are some of the things that men experience, not exclusively, but more commonly than women may experience them in depression. Again, I don't want to keep saying this, but both can happen to either. So even though I'm saying men, this can happen to women, and when I say the other, it can also happen for men. So one of the things that men often experience when they're depressed is an increase in risk-taking. The really broad stroke of it is that guys are trying to avoid their feelings. Guys often feel like they will get trapped in their feelings if they let them show up too much, right? That it's going to take over, you're not going to be able to make decisions, you're going to be crying for hours, if not days, and then who's going to, right? And so men are usually trying to avoid that state of kind of despair that they assume will come along sometimes with their feelings. And that's just when they're with themselves. When they're with other people, they're also going to be really conscious of not looking weak. They're going to be really conscious of being able to stand stuff and being, tough. Whether or not you're a tough guy, certainly you've gotten that message as a man in, modern day. I was going to say America, but probably most everywhere, that there's some toughness or in strength that folks would like to see out of you, such that expressing emotions, and this is something that is very Western and very modern, but such that expressing your emotions, certainly sadness, might indicate some weakness. And so a lot of what you're going to see here is just an avoidance of feelings. So here we have risk-taking, and this is going to be things like gambling. This is going to be things like addiction. In addition to that self-soothing, which may be happening with some of those things, these are also going to be distracting. These are also going to be things that keep me from thinking about the fact that I'm really upset that my girlfriend left me, or I'm really, really worried that they're not going to hire me for this job, and then what did I put all that time into college for, or something, right? And so to avoid all of those feelings, I'm going to go jump off a mountain. I'm going to drive really fast in the street. I'm going to go get in a fight at this bar. I'm going to go cheat on my girlfriend, and now I'm worried about this. I'm going to, right? And so there are all these things that the person might do to kind of distract themselves from their own life, or in some ways maybe even give themselves something different to worry about, to be focused on, rather than this thing that is pressing on them in such a way that would make them want to distract themselves, right? And so even though some of the stuff that looks like risk-taking may seem more dangerous and more distressing, the fact that they are ready to engage in risk-taking to distract themselves from whatever that initial distressor was, suggests that for them it's going to be the more distressing of the things. When we get to anxiety, I have a bit of a story I can share about a client who was doing some of this to distract himself, not from depression in this case, but from anxiety, and that can often show up in some strange ways. The other thing, I'm going to check the time really quick. Okay, the other thing is escapist behavior, and this is going to be really, really similar to that risk-taking. So where the risk-taking is also going to have this added kind of endorphin rush, this added, maybe you need some dopamine because you're depressed, right? Whatever it is, the risk-taking is going to have that added piece in addition to being a distractor. But the escapist behavior is a little bit more pure distraction. And this can often look pretty strange, because one of the things that guys tend to do when they're engaging in this due to some depression is not necessarily, though they might, not necessarily throw themselves into something like a video game or something like, again, you can use some of these other things, sex, gambling, right, in addition to those things being risky, depending on kind of what the sex or the gambling looks like, I guess. They also can just be escapist behavior, right? They're also just ways to waste time. I'm going to go play the penny slots at the casino for the next 3 nights because I don't want to go home and think about whatever it is, right? And so maybe you're not even spending a lot of money. It's not risky in that way, but it is escapist, right? You're kind of taking yourself away, bright flashing lights, maybe gonna win some money, and so I'm still escaping even if it's not risky. I just want to kind of cut that, split that hair, if you will. But with the escapist behavior in particular, right, sometimes it's not risky at all. Sometimes for folks it doesn't look like this guy's wasting time at the casino or this guy's wasting time playing video games. Sometimes it looks like this guy goes to the gym for 3 hours every day. That's really impressive. He's really, really dedicated, right? Or this guy is always staying after work. He hangs out 2 hours past 5 every day and does extra work. I don't see any of you folks doing that, right? And so there's these ways in which sometimes what you see is that guys or others will throw themselves into work or throw themselves into something that is actually seemingly productive, and yet it is still this way of escaping whatever it is that they're trying to avoid dealing with, right? So if they're depressed about home life, if they're worried about, what's going to happen in the future, that really is more of an anxiety piece. But whatever it is, if they're depressed about something, if their feelings are being weighed down in some way, they may just choose, I'd rather be at work making money than having to sit at home thinking about this. I'd rather be at the gym trying to, get bigger, get healthier, rather than, sitting around dealing with whatever thing I'm going to think up if I sit in bed and all these thoughts start popping in my head. And so that escapist behavior, again, this one often gets missed because sometimes it can look like, oh, this person's just working really hard. Students, right? This person studies, is in the library all the time, writing papers, doing research, whatever it is, hanging out with other students to try to get that project done. That could still be escapist behavior, right? That could still be this person just throwing themselves into something to distract from something else. And then I've been talking about this the whole time, of course, which is anger, right? So this is going to be the emotion that men are usually most comfortable expressing. Men are really limited in terms of socially approved emotions that they can show, certainly in front of strangers, but even in many cases in front of folks who are close to them, friends or family. Not only things like sadness, of course, right? Boys don't cry, this type of messaging that guys are kind of given their whole life, man up, toughen up, all this type of stuff, right? And so all this stuff kind of closes in on guys, and they certainly feel like they can't express sadness, which is why here we have anger as a symptom of male or masculine depression, because instead of feeling sad, often what happens for guys is that feeling gets transmuted into anger. That is to say, they feel sad initially, but they change that feeling around in their mind, so that now they just show up angry, right? They're punching walls because girlfriend dumps him and he doesn't cry on the couch, right? He peels out of the driveway, punches walls, screams, whatever it is, right? This is this anger showing up rather than a sadness, which is the initial emotion. But I can't be weak. She just broke up with me. Maybe she broke up with me because I'm weak, and so, right, you kind of go to angry mode instead of, please, baby, take me back, right? Instead of sad mode. So again, anger, I should also point out, and this isn't necessarily related to depression, but guys will also switch other emotions into anger. Guys will switch joy into anger. If you're not supposed to be too happy, that's too gay. You're overreacting to, right? And so they might change this into anger, right? You get really happy, and so you punch your buddy as hard as you can in the arm. Yeah. So this is again a thing, right? Even violence. This is a thing you'll often see guys do, both again for positive emotions, if they feel like it's not safe or it's not a good way to express how happy or how much love they have for a buddy that they haven't seen in a while, right? They'd rather just tackle him and then they give him a hug or say, "I really missed you, man." They'd rather kind of show this in a more aggressive way. I don't think that kind of thing is so bad, but just broadly get that message home, right? That this is anger and aggression is something that men are allowed to do, or some of the other emotions we consider to go along with depression, they are not often allowed to do. So you see the anger. The other way that's listed here is pain. And if you remember when we talked about, I think you would have seen this in the video from my Gen Psych class, but when we were talking about cognitive dissonance or intrapsychic conflict, as it were, in that case we were talking about between the id, ego, and superego, and that, sometimes that would show up in terms of a conscious anxiety, sometimes that would show up in terms of a defense mechanism, but then the other way it could show up would be in terms of a physical manifestation, right? So stress symptoms, that is to say headaches, that is to say muscle aches, that is to say stomach aches, sweating, all of these different types of things that we might associate with anxiety, that we might associate with, in particular, physical or bodily stress, are things that you might also see here from guys, from men who are experiencing depression, who aren't letting themselves feel that emotion, who aren't letting themselves kind of process whatever the conflict is, whatever the kind of loss is that they're experiencing. If they can't do some of that, whether it has to do with depression or really anything, they may experience that as pain. They may experience that as some type of physical symptom that shows up, again, whether aches and pains, whether some kind of illness, whether real or somaticized, but these folks will often experience, guys, that is to say, can often experience some of these symptoms in their body rather than psychologically. Again, they seem to be trying to not let that happen. So these are the things that I pulled out that seemed to be particularly different, or at least weren't listed at all in the DSM in terms of the major depressive disorder. And so these 4 here are the ones that I wanted to highlight. But you can see down here that there is just also a list of other symptoms, and most of these are really just reworded DSM-5 symptoms of depression. So feeling guilty, worthless, that you will always fail, was almost right out of the DSM. Feeling restless and or irritable, out of the DSM. Having no energy, problems sleeping, not sleeping or sleeping too much, feeling like you can't work or get things done, using alcohol or drugs to feel better, right? All of these are still out of the DSM. Sexual inability, I think that's in the DSM. If it isn't, I probably should have put it up here. That's going to be a big one for guys in particular. Women are also going to have some sexual issues when they're depressed. That is not uncommon, but of course, just for guys, it's going to feel more like an inability than it is going to feel like just like a lack of interest or a low libido, right? For a man, he's probably going to notice if his partner initiates sex and he's unable to, is a different feeling than is I just don't want to, right? And those are kind of in different places. And so guys are probably going to notice this more than they are going to necessarily notice that they don't want to, though that may also come up if your partner, for instance, or somebody that you're with has an active or higher sex drive than you, right, and they are initiating more, then you might say, well, I am noticing that I'm also not interested, but generally, guys will notice the inability a little bit more, and women, again, will notice usually more the interest, the lack of interest, right? I don't feel like it, I'm not in the mood type of a thing. Losing interest in hobbies, work, and or sex, right? So here I'm trying to hit that interest piece that can come from sex in both cases, but also this is just that symptom or that criteria number 2 out of the DSM, where they're saying loss of interest or pleasure in activities that once made you happy or that you enjoyed. And so this kind of loss of interest is hitting on that. Having problems focusing, remembering, or making choices, missing work, class, or appointments, not caring about anything or feeling blank, always feeling sad or nervous. That's that symptom 1, right? Just depressed mood most days. And then changes in appetite and or weight, which is also going to be right out of the DSM-5. So overall, right, most of this is really just the same, and then looking at some things that might be particularly different, or some things that men may not notice if they're just reading it out of the DSM, because you may notice some of these things and not go, oh, it's depression, right? You might say, okay, I'm having a bit of trouble with my appetite, and I just really haven't felt like, I don't know, playing golf recently, and I have been a little bit tired, but I don't feel sad. I don't feel, I don't feel like I can't sleep. You might go through the list and say, well, I don't feel like any of those other things. But then if I show you this, you might go, oh, well, I have been really angry lately, and I have been having these really, really bad headaches, right? Some of these things you might put together and go, oh, this kind of puts that picture together for me that this is probably just some depression. So next I wanted to just look at some ways in which suicide is also going to be affected by things like culture, things like sex, identity, these pieces. And so just looking at some suicide statistics, this is from the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention website. And so you can see that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. That's pretty high. I do think I've seen it higher on this list. I think I've seen it as high as 8th just over the years. They do update this every year or so, and so I think I've seen it a little bit higher. But 10 is still really high. 10 is still the 10th leading cause of death. If you think about heart attacks and car accidents, and I guess plane crashes are actually pretty rare, but all of a bunch of any other illness, right, that you could possibly get. The fact that suicide is number 10 is actually pretty staggering, I think, right? That there are all of these ways to die accidentally, and the one that is to die on purpose, and that is often associated with some type of mental illness, is really high up on the list, right? It's only number 10. So that's the first piece. So 48,000 Americans, over 48,000 die by suicide in the United States each year. And then in 2018, there were about 1.4 million suicide attempts. So you can see obviously that there are far, far, far more attempts than there are actual, I don't know if we want to call it successes, but completions, I guess. But these numbers are still really high. So what I want to direct your attention to, and I do want you to think back to that chart on depression, and we saw that women, people of color, older folks, that this was the group of people that were most likely to be depressed, right? That women were more likely to be depressed, I think 2 to 1, that older people were more likely to be depressed. The chart didn't give us numbers, it just had a bar graph. It looked about 2 to 1, and that people of color were more likely to be depressed. It was nowhere near 2 to 1. It was about 0.1% increase or so. But those facts are still interesting, especially when we come here to see that quite different than what you see for depression is that for suicide, the age-adjusted suicide rate was 14.2 per 100,000 individuals. What that means is about 14.2 people per 100,000. So for every 100,000 people in a lot, you would expect that about 14 of them would commit suicide, right? So that's how we count that. What was the rate of suicide in 2018? Now here's the stuff I'm talking about. The rate of suicide is highest among middle-aged, so not older, white, not person of color, and men, not women. Suicide rate is highest for middle-aged white men. This is something I usually like to draw out a lot of conversation in class about. That is to say, thinking about this idea of why is it that depressed that depression affects women and people of color and the elderly more, whereas suicide hits men in the middle age and who are white the most. What's going on about that difference? And we'll explore that here in just a little bit. But also you see here in 2018, men died by suicide about 3.6 times more often than women. So we had that 2-to-1 ratio of depression, but here this suicide rate is almost double that, right? Men are dying by suicide 3.56 times more than women, whereas women tend to be about twice, or diagnosed with depression about twice as often as men. And then I think the other interesting statistic to maybe kind of help us police the rule two here, I guess, white males accounted for 69.67. That's almost 70% of suicides. That's a lot. So white men accounted for almost 70% of suicides in 2018, and then in 2018, firearms accounted for about 50.6% of all suicide deaths. So there's something going on with white guys in terms of suicide, especially given our sense that they, as men and as white folks, do not get as depressed as people of color, as women do. And yet, when it comes to suicide, we see that they are killing themselves more than 3 times as much. So what's going on here? Well, one thing I think we sort of have to think about is there is something, I'm not sure where the camera's pointed, there is something that we call minority stress. And this is something that we might think of as accounting for some of those differences, at least in depression rates. And what minority stress is just these little things that happen to different minorities, people of color, gays and lesbians, women, disabled folks, just these little things that are gonna happen day to day that in and of themselves aren't incredible stressors, but as an accumulation can be a significant stress point in a person's life. So what does that look like? Well, this might be something like, let's say I'm a Muslim, an Arab Muslim man, and I am, I just got my degree from UCM, I got my MBA, and so now I'm starting my own marketing business, and well, this requires that I travel all over the country and I talk to different people and I try to sell them and connect them to my business, right? Well, maybe you figured this out already, but if I'm an Arab Muslim guy, well, and I've got to be traveling a lot on airplanes, guess what that experience is going to be like for me most times that I'm trying to get through security, most times that I'm trying to get on plane, whether or not I'm the one who gets the random search. I think if you ask an Arab person or you ask a Muslim person, many of them will have the sense that they are being searched more, that they are being randomly selected more often. Fine, whether or not you believe that to be true, what's the experience of that person when they step on the plane, right? And they're walking down the aisle and everybody's looking at you and thinking, do you want this guy to sit next to you? Thinking about your broad safety, certainly in COVID times, also thinking about your health. What's that experience gonna be like even just, getting into the airport, right? And before you get on the plane, just walking through the airport and walking past security guards and all of these different things. Are you gonna be the one to get the hassle? And even if you're not, aren't you already thinking about that you're gonna be the one to get the hassle? So whether or not the hassle shows up, you're already hassling yourself in your head, right? And then, of course, when you get to the security line, the hassle begins. And then, of course, when you get on the plane, nobody's got a free seat and everybody's kind of staring at you throughout the flight, right? So whatever it is, maybe none of that happens, maybe it all does. But the idea is that that's a stressor. right? It's not a big deal. You get off the plane, you go sell your business, you make, I don't know, a couple $100,000 for that plane ticket. Definitely worth people staring at you on the plane, and yet the next time you do that, when you go home, it's going to happen again probably, and then when you go on that vacation because you made such a good killing this year, and then when you come home, right, all of that stuff just over and over again, in addition to probably what other stressors that person might be experiencing because of his race and or his religion, right? This is what we call minority stress, these little things that can cricket you, that can eventually get to making someone have some type of mental illness, mental breakdown, or just being broadly stressed. Maybe it's not diagnosable, but you're starting to have some of these headaches, or you're starting to have some of this kind of nervousness in certain situations. The thing, though, about minority stress is interesting. The thing about any type of stress, any type of suffering, is that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. This is true. This is true in psychology. This is true in medicine. And so what is happening for these folks is, even though they're having these little things happen to them, one of the things that I've talked about in my class, and usually, again, this is a talking point, I ask the class, why is there this difference in some of the stuff that we talk about, and some of the stuff that students and I've come up with has to do with this idea that minority stress may, while it's not good, I'm here to tell you, while it's not good, it may also be teaching the person to guard against adversity, right? If this little stuff is happening to me all the time, every day, in this situation and that one, no matter where I go, right? If this type of thing is happening to me, well, I mean, I'm gonna have to get through my life, so I'm gonna build some robustness to that criticism, to feeling sad, to feeling worried, to feeling anxious in this situation, to people responding to me in a way that I don't like, right? I'm gonna get some kind of guard to that, right? I'm used to it now. Yeah, it still sucks, and I may even get depressed, but I'm used to it, right? I'll get through this. I'll talk to somebody, and here's one of the other things that we've come up with in the class, is that people of color, and women in particular, right, tend to talk their problems out within their community. They at least have that available to them in the sense of many people of color, not all of them, but if I am having an experience that I feel like is about me being black, well, I have some people I know I can call and say, you know, I don't know if you need to believe me, but this sucked, right? And that's just my family is what I'm talking about, right? I have somebody that I know is gonna get that on that level. I have somebody who I know understands that stress. I have somebody who I know would be willing to talk about and take my side if it comes down to that, right? That would be willing to take my side with regard to that. If I'm a woman, just in general, women are more likely to talk through their problems. They're more likely to call a friend or call a family member and say, listen, I'm feeling really stressed today, or I can't believe what this jerk said to me at work today. You know, whatever it is, women tend to be more likely to do that. But for white men, right, they're in neither one of those groups. They're men, and so they are often discouraged from sharing their feelings. They're often discouraged from letting somebody know that something's going wrong and that they need help, whether that be a friend or a professional, right? They're often discouraged from that. They don't necessarily, and this would be true of white women too, and this is just what students have told me, and this is borne out in the research to some degree, that there's not this same level of community with regard to family, with regard to extended family, right? There aren't all of these wagons, so to speak, circled around you in terms of community and family and support. That people of color tend to do that a little bit more, right? That black folks and Asian folks and Latin folks usually have big family, experiences, or just have big families, or keep grandma around, or grandma just lives a town away or a block away or whatever, that all of this kind of community, aunts and uncles, cousins, right, all of that tends to be a little bit more held on to, if not kind of, I was going to say important, I don't know that it's more important, but I think it's just more available in many people of color communities and in their families. Now, that's not everybody, and certainly there are going to be white folks who say, like, listen, my grandma lives with me and my other grandma, and that's awesome. But I'm just trying to think about, right, what's going on? I'm just trying to answer this question. What is that? And so the fact that people of color and women have this community that they can go to, and that women have a little bit more in terms of an out of just allowing themselves to be sad and be upset and tell someone about that, and that people of color have this built in, I know that you're going to get what I'm talking about if I'm dealing with some sort of minority stress, and people of color have built in, and women built in. Listen, people are gonna make passes at me all day if I'm a woman, and I'm gonna have to learn to get on with it. People are gonna say subtly or overtly racist things to me. Most days I'm gonna have to, learn to deal with it or get over it, right? Any one of these things that are coming at you, people are gonna doubt my abilities. People are gonna say you only got this job because you're so pretty, whatever it is, right? You're gonna have to learn how to kind of grow a skin to that, to grow some robustness. And I don't mean to say white guys aren't strong, but this might be a way in which they have not been conditioned. They aren't necessarily as conditioned to daily face this direct and personal type of adversity. They aren't conditioned to, when they do, to go out and seek a friend or family member that's gonna understand, or at least to explore and process their own feelings. And so there's this way in which white men are at this loss here. Add to this something that I would coin as majority stress, which is to say, if I'm a black man and I tell my parents, when I grow up I'm going to be a professor, I'm going to teach students psychology, I'm going to have my own clinical practice, right? I'm going to say all these things I'm going to do, and then I just end up, working at the gas station down the road. Well, you're a black man, it's hard out there for a black guy. You're lucky you didn't get killed. You're lucky that your parents are still around and they're still married and your dad's in your life, right? And there's this subtle racism I'm talking about, but here's, they're gonna make excuses for me, is what I'm saying. They're gonna say, well, it would have been awesome if you could have done that, but nobody really expected it, consider where you come from and all the hurdles you're gonna have to jump through, right? White guys do not get that luxury, I imagine. There's probably specific things that a person could point to for any individual, of course. I've never been good at math. But in general, there's not this kind of expectation of failure, this sort of subtle expectation of failure. There's not this way in which if they fail, they go, well, yeah, it's tough. People may be understanding and people may be supportive and compassionate, but there isn't this mindset in that other individual, and then certainly in the individual themselves, right? This stuff gets internalized, let me tell you, right? If I fail, not only are other people gonna make excuses, guess what? I'm gonna make excuses for myself. Well, most people didn't even get out of the neighborhood, so. But I don't know that white men in particular sort of have that narrative available to them to say, well, unless maybe you come from a really difficult neighborhood or you come from a really low income family or area, and then there's some stuff to kind of lean into, well, I've gotten through this adversity, and even if I don't make it, look how far I've come. Nobody's really expected me, so there's not this pressure for me to have to be the doctor, be the lawyer, be the whatever it is. But I do think white guys feel that a lot, whether they know it or not. I think if we could compare, we would see that they feel this such that failure feels huge. Nobody to talk to, no reason to fail, no expectation of failure. Haven't really had to fight my way through a whole lot comparatively, right? I don't want to be sensitive to other individuals' lives, but just all things being equal, right? I don't have to fight my way through that, so I haven't necessarily built up this robustness. And all of this connects for me in this sense of, yeah, white guys do not get as depressed as much, right? They don't get as depressed as much. But when they do, right, they really have to figure some stuff out. Otherwise, here we are, almost 4 times as high of suicide rates as women. And the reason, by the way, it's middle-aged white men is because here's where you notice, oh, I didn't become the doctor. I'm 38 now, and I'm still at the gas station, and I told myself I'd go back to school. Maybe it's too late for that. Maybe I'm not going to be anything. Everybody expected so much of me, right? And here we have this kind of thinking that can lead to that type of thing, right? So for me, this paints that picture, and I'm sorry if that feels a little offensive to some folks, but I'm just trying to be academic here and be honest, because I think white guys in particular there is some attention that needs to be paid. Not necessarily that people of color and women also don't need attention paid to them, but I think we also gotta see what's going on with these folks, because we do have some clear data here that this is a problem. Lastly, before I go, it looks like we're not going to get to bipolar disorder. I keep running over, and that's okay. That just won't be on this particular test, and you can use it for a paper if you like. But I just wanted to show you this here as well, right? That when we're looking at race, this doesn't do by race and sex, I don't think. No, but when we do by just race, what you can see here is this is white folks, this blue line, and the red one is Native American. Right, that was me talking about the fact that Native Americans often have pretty high rates of stuff as well. I actually thought it was going to be higher than white folks, but it's just right under it. And then you see here, we got this big gap between, I think, Asian and then black folks, right? And then talking about some of the things that we talked about in terms of community and facing through strife and, some sort of robustness of having to have dealt with whether it be racism or just adversity or sexism or whatever it is, right, that may offer some protection in the future. I think this bears out here in the fact that we see both Asian and black folks down here. We don't have a Latino American measure, but I believe they're a little bit higher than Asian and black folks, but they're not up at this level. So, okay, that's it. Hopefully this video is still recording. I'm gonna go check right after this. My class is being really patient because they're late. But if you have any questions, go ahead and ask me. Again, the test should be posted along with this video or a couple days later, and then that test will be due the following Monday, so the Monday after the weekend, after when you're seeing this. So again, let me know if you have any questions, and then when we get back next time, we'll start talking about anxiety disorders. I may say a little bit more about bipolar disorder in that lecture as well, since we didn't get a chance to get to it today. And then again, your test will just be on that opening section of thinking about how things are categorized and organized, and then also on depression and everything that we've talked about, depression and suicide, everything we've talked about today. All right, I will see you next week, and good luck on the test. See you then.